Hello and welcome to Reinfused. Today we are taking a look at some of, the first part really of Amstrad's home computer range. So more dealing with the smaller micros rather than their professional PCW ones, etc. The first machine we're looking at, well, let's set the story for that one. It was the early 1980s and the UK was experiencing a boom in the computer market, specifically the home computer market, with several manufacturers releasing their own machines and the market was noticeably growing. This caught the interest of Alan Sugar, who had decided he needed to move into more markets to increase his profits. Now, his company Amstrad, which stands for Alan Michael Sugar Trading, good old Alan. It specialised in making affordable versions of electronics, specifically, really, or mostly at least, high-end Japanese hi-fi systems and stuff. But these were made at a much lower cost, and they were never going to be as good as those versions, but that wasn't really the point. The point was they were good enough, and they were affordable, and so people would get things that looked vaguely like these high-end systems for a price they could actually afford, which made Amstrad quite successful in that market. But when it came to the computer market, he realised that wasn't quite going to work the same way. Whilst, yeah, he could definitely make machines as affordable as possible, he was really going to have to also fight on the merits of his machines. I think especially if you kind of read between the lines, he had a bit of an issue with Sir Clive Sinclair as well, so the thought of putting a machine into market that was more successful than Sinclair's machines, but not because of price, but because of literal quality, I think was probably high up on his agenda as well. Some proof to this. Part of this comes from a quote from Sugar himself, where he actually remarked that he wants his computers to look like real computers and not pregnant calculators, which was almost certainly aimed at the ZX80 and the ZX81. So Sugar talked to Ivor Spital and told him to basically go and check the market out and see what their options were as far as entering it. And he did, and he got a lot of information on the other people in the market, on the manufacturing costs, on where you can get parts from. And he basically said, yep, we should definitely do this. We can definitely make an affordable machine, a machine that's less than £200, and we can put in a monitor as well so that it can be its own little unit rather than little Timmy having to use his parents' TV. They could be using it more often. The machine that's used more often becomes more profitable because, especially when you've got software sales in that as well. Initially, Spital kind of spec'd up a 6502 base machine, and they got a couple of developers, a couple of hardware engineers involved to try to develop this machine based around the 6502 processor. Now, it's a fairly popular processor, and if you look at the machines it was contained in, you can kind of see why Amstrad were looking at that. It had a fairly high profile. It was in the Commodore 64, it was in the BBC Micro, it was in the Apple II. So these were all machines that had really made their mark on the industry, so you can kind of understand why they looked at that as being a machine that people would take more seriously. However, a lot of issues came about. This whole machine was being made at a very accelerated time frame, which we'll get into in a minute. And the initial developers had basically said they could do that, they could do it in this amount of time, but they couldn't. There was no way. One of the developers got so stressed out that he literally collapsed from exhaustion, and the father had to take him away to recuperate somewhere. So they had to look at other options. They brought on a company called Ambit to consult on the process of making both the hardware side and the software side work. Ambit was a company run by Roland Perry and William Pohl, and they're fairly synonymous with the CPC range for the very reason that they literally made it happen pretty much. They shopped around for somebody to make the actual software for the system, because obviously once that's done, then it kind of helps to inform what the hardware is going to be. It's a give and take situation. Now, Roland Perry had a friend in Acorn, manufacturers also of the BBC Micro, and they recommended a small company called Locomotive Software, who were based in Dorking. They visited them, and these guys had just been writing lots of Z80 software for Acorn, for their Z80 add-on for their BBC Micros, and so they had the groundwork done for a Z80 basic already, and so that kind of pushed the whole process forward. So they would be developing a Z80 basic for a Z80 machine now, and so the move from 6502 to Z80 was done. So everything was in place, as was Alan Sugar's general way of doing things. He'd already signed off on the actual visual design of the machine. He'd got the tooling made to make the case. The tape recorder player was already in place on the machine, which you'll see in a minute if you've never seen a 464. So literally, the PCB was being made to fit an already existing form, which I guess in a way, whilst it's constricting for the PCB designer, they at least have already something, they know what they have to fit the components around already. So that, in that way, it's kind of good. And this is all part, again, of this accelerated time frame. So the locomotive software had 12 weeks to make their basic, and the whole thing was done in 9 months. So literally 9 months after Amstrad began this process, Alan Sugar called a press event to launch the 464. And that's an absolutely astonishing feat of engineering to go from being completely not in the market at all and using experienced partners, which was something that Alan Sugar was especially very, very good at, was using experienced partners to help him get a product into the production. But that's to take a computer idea, design it, go through 2 iterations of design as well, the 652 and then the Z80, and then to actually release it in the space of 9 months and successfully release it as well. So the 464 was being released around the same time as the Sinclair QL, which was supposed to be Sinclair's follow-up to the Sinclair Spectrum. And that machine had failed miserably to be released. It missed 2 deadlines. The final versions that were released were incredibly buggy because it had been rushed through because Sir Clive had basically given a release date which had no bearing at all to the engineering task at hand. Whereas Sugar had literally broken that process down and said, these steps should take this long, this is how long we've got to do it. And he had, instead of announcing, we're going to be in the market at this point, he had told everyone we have to be ready at this point. And then when it became obvious they were going to be ready, then he kind of announced that it was going to be out there. A very, very different way of doing things. And I guess kind of the reason, let's be honest, why, as much as I love Sir Clive, and I genuinely do, as you've seen in a lot of my videos, I credit him strongly for me being in the computer industry at all because of the Sinclair Spectrum. But that's the big difference between Sir Clive Sinclair and Alan Sugar. Alan Sugar was a very good businessman. I mean, we can take the mickey out of a lot of the stuff he does now, like the emailer and things like that, and his Twitter record. But he was a good businessman, and he knew how to get products to market, and he knew how to get himself the right people, to do the right stuff. In fact, the case in point on this is the ULA for the 464 was being made by Ferranti. And Ferranti's process, which had already caused issues for Acorn with the Electron at this point, was also causing issues with the 464. They just couldn't get the way that Amstrad needed the ULA to work, and the process that Ferranti used to make chips just wasn't meshing, didn't work. So they effectively had 2 options. They could either redesign the ULA to work differently so it did work with Ferranti's process, or they could strip down the ULA and add a ton more components, which would make the actual machine more expensive. Neither of these things sat well with Alan Sugar, so he literally just wrote off the amount of money he owed Ferranti for doing what they'd done already and just went to a different manufacturer. In fact, it went to 2 different manufacturers because he fell out with the original one, and then eventually SGS in Italy made the ULA. But that was a very ballsy move for someone to do. It was costing him money already, but he knew what he wanted to release, and he was literally willing to write off that cost to release what he had decided upon. An incredible tactic, and it did end up with a machine that released in 9 months, was out on time when Sugar said this is when we're going to release it. It was released, it shipped to shops. He got everything in place so that the traditionally very Spectrum, Sinclair, heavy retailers like WH Smith's were willing to buy lots of stock up front of the CPC range and actually stock it as well, which was, although Sinclair didn't do anything to get it to happen, they generally kind of stocked more Spectrum stuff than anything else. Even the Condor 64 suffered slightly from that. So to get that done, that took a lot of work, and when the machine was released, it was rock solid. It just worked. And it genuinely does. I mean, I've got the machines I've got in front of me now, do just work, and they work straight away. One doesn't, but there's a reason for that, and it's not the fault of the design. We'll get into that in a minute. So yeah, it was just to look at the incredible amount of work done to get this. It was just an amazing feat of engineering, which is really not remarked upon a lot. Locomotive software, I would say, the basic, they could have just shipped a basic that worked, so the machine booted up into something, could load games, and that was it. But they didn't. They looked at what the Amstrad were trying to release, at the abilities they were trying to give it, and they properly tailored the basic around that. So the basic in the Amstrad 44 is probably one of the most advanced basics that had been released at that point. It could do all kinds of stuff that the no other basics could. And they did that in 12 weeks. And it's, again, an astonishing feat, which just really doesn't seem to ever be remarked about. Anyway, yeah, the 464 was eventually released on the 21st of June 1984 on time, and it was released in two SKUs, two unit types. The first one came bundled with a colour monitor, and that was released for about £349, and the other with a green monochrome screen for about £239. Incredible prices for a machine that came with a monitor. I mean, you would not have got any other computers for that price with a monitor at that time. Now, we get to the games, and this is kind of where things start to fall apart a little bit for the 464, and it's entirely not the 464's fault. The 464 was an incredible machine, a very powerful machine for its time. But in the UK, and also slightly in Spain as well, the Spectrum had become the dominant machine. And because of that, especially when you talk in terms of Z80 machines as well, because of that, a lot of the games publishers were not willing to throw a lot of money at other machines. And so the Amstrad was cursed with lots and lots of lazy ports. The MSX also had exactly the same issue, where it was a fairly powerful machine, but the Spectrum versions were generally the first development version, and then they were ported across to those two machines. So yeah, they're never great. They're never good versions. They usually look like the Spectrum version, which, let's be honest, isn't the greatest looking machine ever. But also they're slower, because a lot of the stuff the Spectrum did with its display was quite clever, but mostly to cut down cost. But it actually meant it could do a lot of stuff quite quickly. And if you didn't do it correctly for other machines, it just meant you had a slower game. So you don't really see the power of the 464 when you base it on the UK market. However, the 464 and the Amstrad machines, full stop actually, were very popular across Europe. I mean, they sold out nearly 2 million units, possibly over 2 million units across Europe. And they were especially popular in France, but also in Germany, where they were distributed by Schneider. And so if you look at the games that came, especially from France, you genuinely get an idea of what the actual machine was capable of. And they do look fantastic as well when you look at those games. Now, I never knew any of this because as a kid, as I've said many times before, I was a specky boy. And because fanboy wars existed, even back then in the dawn and distant time of my youth when I had hair, if you liked the Spectrum, that was it. The Spectrum was the greatest machine, and there was no argument. It didn't matter what the box art and what reviewers said, the Spectrum was always the best machine. Now, as a grown adult, where I get the benefit of being able to buy whatever machines I want to buy, and being an owner of all of them pretty much now, or the ones that are available in this era, I know the Spectrum was by far not the best machine for games in that era. And I've kind of really grown a love for the Amstrads. I would put the Amstrad as being the best machine of that era, because certainly of the big three, because it just has, when you use the proper games, it's just got so much untapped power inside it, and the sound was pretty good as well. It could really throw graphics around, really do very good scrolling when it was done properly as well as that. So it was genuinely a great machine. And I put the Commodore second, to be honest. Again, we used to take the mick out of it, say just everything looked brown was basically the big argument with the Commodore. But again, when you look at some of the really, really good games for the Commodore 64, it was just capable of so much more than the Spectrum. However, the Spectrum will always be my heart because it's the machine I grew up with and got me on my things. So it will always still be my favourite machine. But as a realist, I can see in terms of games, it wasn't the best choice. Now, this wasn't obviously the end of the Amstrad systems. It went on to do other machines. The 664 was released, which replaced the floppy drive with 3-inch disk drive. A machine we'll see again. If you look at my Plus 3 video, that's all my Tatung Einstein video, the 3-inch discs feature in that. And then eventually the 128K model came out, so the 6128 128K with a disk drive as well. There was also obviously the Spanish version, which had an extra few K on board, which wasn't used, but was just there to get around the greater than 64K limit that were on import tariffs that Spain had put up. I think I mentioned that in my Plus 3 review, and it's a nice bit of duty avoidance by Amstrad. So yeah, I guess, another machine actually, before the other machines after that, they also eventually released the Plus models, so the CPC Plus models, which radically changed the design as well to make them kind of more akin to the Atari ST Amstrad style of design, but also improve the graphics and a lot of other things as well. And from that came the GX4000, Amstrad's very failed console, which is a machine I would absolutely, definitely cover at some point. I personally love it. And I'm not the only one in the retro community, but when you actually get to playing it and you make sure you don't use a dodgy power supply, it has some great games on it, especially some of the ones now that have been backported from the other the CPC Plus range. And it has some very nice games that have been released at the right time. It's probably been done quite well. I'll cover that when I do that. When I do that review. Right. Well, let's take a little look at the machine first, and then we'll go on to some games. Here they are in all their multicoloured glory. And they are very colourful machines. So I've got two here. There was slightly different designs. I'm guessing one came after the other. I don't know. I'll be honest, I don't know which is which. Certainly on the bottom, they're very different. This one has a very professional sticker, whereas this one... it's kind of, a sort of professional sticker. Well, that's the more professional one, sorry. That's with the serial number properly written in, whereas this one, go back to this one, has kind of a separate label, the serial number. So I'm guessing they were just made at slightly different times. But yeah, you can see they're very colourful. The overall kind of dark grey design, but with the highlighted keys is very pleasing. I like it quite a lot. And here's the built-in disk drive as well. This is the thing that mainly goes wrong with these machines. Sometimes more than other times. So this one's had a belt replaced. That's the thing that goes. There's a couple of belts in here, one that runs the timer and one that actually runs the mechanism itself. They both will probably need replacing if this machine has been sitting around for too long, because they just turned to goo. This one especially, I had to practically take all the things apart just to get all the goo out. This one is the first one I ever bought, and I got it from the eBay with the usual "this has not been tested" tag. When I received it, I found out that the mechanism had actually gone from the tape system. There's literally just enough to hold the spindles in, the rest of it's missing. So, to be fair, it would have been very hard to test it without a tape mechanism. So I guess they told the truth there. Anyway, what I did for this one, because it had no tape mechanism, is I made these two holes at the back. So that's a tape ear and a tape remote. So I can use an external tape player, or indeed Casduino, which is what I do use more often. Whereas this one is unmodified. Nothing wrong there. Although you will see there is slight differences to the back as well. So if we look here, you can kind of see all of these ports are now over here on this machine. The user port has entirely gone, as has the this I/O port it's marked as, which I think was maybe a tape in. I don't know. I guess not, because I did that. Who knows? The printer port's over here, and this has been moved over here as well. So there were subtle differences to the design. Actually, the way this is done, I would assume that this was made after the 664, because that's very similar changes to what the 664 had. Oh, there you go. Sorry, the user port and the I/O port are now on the side. The user port being obviously a joystick port, sorry. So yeah, it's pretty obvious that was going to be there. On this side, which should be the same as the other one, is the on-off switch and the volume button for the tape. The on-off switch is also a thing that goes wrong, but usually it just needs a bit of cleaning. And yeah, the other machine has the exact same thing on that side, and obviously nothing on that side because those are on the back. Really should have looked at these before I started filming it. Oh well. They're very tasteful machines. I like the design quite a lot. The very plain dark grey is really broken up quite nicely by highlighting all the special buttons. I've kind of prefer this label to this one. I'm assuming, this is a later machine because of the changes they've made. I do kind of prefer this raised Amstrad on here rather than the flat highlighted sticker there. But yeah, an on-off power line. That had also broken on this machine as well. But I'm guessing just because it's connected to where the tape drive goes, and so when they're removing all the bits from inside it, they broke the light off at the same time. Easy enough fix, of course. Just have to resolder it. Yeah, so we didn't really go through the ports that well, did we? So this is a monitor port. You can reuse it quite easily. There are a lot of leads available to do so. Now, generally, this power is supposed to come from the monitor, so you effectively plug all the power into the monitor, and the monitor gives you these two cables to actually connect to the machine and power it. These can all be bought separately now, fortunately, as separate things, so you don't have to have the monitor, and the port in the back will give you quite a nice picture, especially through something like an OSSC or even a RetroTink. So, a fascinating machine. I'm quite fond of it. I think I'm quite fond of the style as well. They are very bulky and very big. Obviously, the Plus one's even more so, to be honest. But they're still, very nice. Just hard to store. These need a lot of cleaning. As you can see, a lot of stuff in my room does because I've been drilling a lot and I didn't cover them properly. My bad. But I will resolve that. Right. Let's try playing a few games. It might take a while to get working, but, you won't know because it'll be a chunker. See you in a minute. Right, so here we are with Prince of Persia. And this is a long load, let me tell you. I mean, it looks pretty good. I mean, obviously it lacks the definition that some of the other versions have, but of the 8-bit versions, I say it looks pretty bloody good. But it also moves really quick, and the animation is, I'd say, spot on. I am just using the keyboard. But I would imagine it will be just as good if you were using a joystick. But yeah, I mean, that looks pretty dead on to me. Same hanging and everything. But yeah, it's a really, really good version. Yes, certainly I'd say better than any other 8-bit version going. Hold the shift key down to gently move. There we go. The movement is very precise as well. Didn't have any problems getting that. Little rabbit drop. Okay, how do you pick up things? Alright, don't know how to pick up things, but... Oh, there we go. You don't duck down, that's how. We can just kind of edge our way to there. And then... Oops, forgot to press up, okay. And that just tells me to press shift to start again. But yeah, no, it's a really, really good conversion. It's got some nice sound. The music, which I'll hopefully play the snippet off if I remembered, was really nice, and the sound effects are all there. Yeah, no, a good game. Let's move on to the next one. And here we are with Contra. Well, as you can see, it's called Grisel there, but it's Contra. And this is another really, really good port of a game. So let's start. 3, 2, 1. And yeah, it's just a really, really colourful game. All I do is remember the keys. There we go. Lots of characters actually. Obviously, flip screen, no scrolling, but that's whilst the Amstrad did have some very, very nice scrolling in some games. It wasn't a strength of the Z80 based machines for whatever reason. But it's a really colourful game. It's very, very fast. It's very responsive. The collision detection is pretty good. Yeah, just a pretty game, really, with and very, very playable. Shoot that guy. Again, this is probably one of the best 8-bit ports of this game, ignoring obviously the consoles, but certainly in the home computer market. Right, I think that's it. I really do like the Amstrad. Again, I was brought up where in a neighbourhood which, was quite poor, so we had Spectrums because they were the cheapest option, and the playground was full of Spectrum owners, so therefore the Spectrum was the best thing ever. So I never really got to know about the Amstrad at all until later on, and it's really channels like Chinny Vision that have kind of pushed me to push on and find more about the Amstrad and to actually get more games for it, and I'm really glad I did. I picked these up at auction. They're relatively affordable, the 464 model anyway. You can generally pick them up. The thing you should be looking for is the tape drive being broken, but that is again just usually the belt that's gone a bit wonky, and you can still get those on eBay easily enough. And yeah, it's not too hard to do the surgery. Requires to have an external port. There are some SD solutions. I do not have one. I need to look one up. Again, Chinny Vision has pointed me in a direction which I will be checking out at some point. But yeah, it's a genuinely good machine, and if you're into retro computers, definitely well worth picking up. So we move now on to the 664, which was it's the follow-up really to the 464 line, and what this did primarily was add a 3-inch floppy drive to the system. So it took away the tape and it added the floppy drive in, and so it's the 6, meaning it's got a disk drive, and again the 64 because it's still got 64K of memory. Now, this was released in May 1985 for £339 with a green screen and £449 with a colour screen. Now, it didn't replace the 464. That stayed in the market, and they also didn't, weirdly enough, reduce the price of the 464. They basically just brought the 664 in a price range just above it, which is fair enough. The 464, I'm guessing they believe was selling as well it was going to, and the price cut wouldn't help. It's understandable. Now, probably the biggest thing about the 664, what it brought mostly was CPM compatibility, specifically 2.2 CPM compatibility. CPM was a huge operating system in the business market, although it was kind of coming close to its end at this point, or at least it was coming to the point where Microsoft was starting to win that business battle. But it was still a fairly important operating system, and having the machine as cheap as the 664 was compared to a lot of the business machines that could run those same applications and open the same documents was a huge deal. There's no real proof that it did a lot for their for their business market, but it certainly was a feature that was talked about at the time, and so almost certainly was key to Amstrad's ability to sell this machine with a disk drive. On the face value, if you look at a 664 and a 464, which I can't do because I don't own a 664, but we'll get onto some reason why we're still about it in a minute. It looks basically the same. The biggest difference are it's much more muted keyboard. You don't get the colours of the 464 had, and they have changed the case design somewhat so the keyboard can be slightly tilted. Presumably, again, focusing on that business market with looking at people who are going to be using the keyboard for very long periods of time. Now, we aren't looking at the 664, because I don't own one, fairly big reason, but mostly because it just didn't stick around for very long. It was in the shops for about really 6 months before Amstrad pulled the carpet underneath it, replacing it with this, which is a 6128, as you can see somewhere. Oh, up here, right. And yeah, if you look at the model number, the 6128, 6 being it's got a disk drive, 128, meaning it's got 128K of memory. So this was released in Europe in 1985. Initially, though, it was released in the United States. The first time, actually, Amstrad had released really any of its products in the States, certainly in a kind of permanent, if you will, format. Now, I've included a 464 here as well, so you can kind of see the difference. The 664 wasn't quite so muted as this. It did have some little bits of blues in there and such, some subtle colours, but they really did, with the 612, go even further to making it, I guess, more professional looking with slightly bland keys. It is a rather bland machine compared to the rest of the Amstrad's lineup, but, or at least in the home market. I digress. So when it hit the UK, it was released for $299 for the green screen and $399 for colour. Yeah, so a small price cut on the 664, plus it was released just a few months later, and it destroyed the 664 model, so it was discontinued. As you can probably imagine, Amstrad were not a particularly popular company with the fans of the 664 at that point. I think that some shops did actually do a deal so you could kind of upgrade for a small price, which seems even worse, really, when you think of it that way. I'm not sure if that was run by Amstrad. It doesn't feel like an Amstrad thing, but yeah, it might have been. But anyway, yeah, it's slightly naughty, but it certainly was a much better machine. I can understand Amstrad not wanting to run 3 separate machines when they could just have kind of a lower end model in the 464 and a higher end model in the 6128. Right. So we take a little look at it. Oh, I guess one thing, the like the 664 was kind of pushed for having the ability to use CPM 2.2. This one went one further and was able to use CPM Plus, which was an improved version of CPM, and again was probably the cheapest way of getting there. Right, so if we look around this machine, the ports on the back are very similar to the later model 464 and also the 664, but there are some differences to this 464, as you can see. Quite a few differences, really. The power switch is now here, whereas it was on the side on, in fact, all the 464 models, I believe. And also this volume switch was dialed, which is also on the side over here. The power now in the centre, and you've got this extra little lead here, which technically I don't need, but I've kept it on there. I'll explain why in a minute. But this was because the floppy disk drive also needed 12 volts, whereas the monitor traditionally only gave out 5 volts through this port. So this allowed it to plug into a 12 volt supply. And these are basically the same, but they're just in different places. On the side, again, we have our user stroke joystick port and a tape port as well, so you can get access to tapes. And yeah, the sound port. So you can put sound out to a device rather than through a speaker. Right. So, on the front, of course, which is where the major changes. There we go. What would normally be a 3-inch floppy drive, it's now a Gotek. I replaced mine. But I think you've seen the floppy drive in the Plus 3 video I've done, hopefully. Exactly the same floppy drive, of course, because Amstrad were building them at that point, and so using their own stock. So it's a neat machine still. You can see it's got the slight slope on the keyboard, like that we were talking about, so helps with ergonomics on the keyboard. But yeah, so the 3-inch disk drive, this is a big thing. Obviously 3.5-inch drives were kind of coming into prominence at this point, but they went with a 3-inch drive, and the reason, it seems, is simply Hitachi had huge stocks of discs, hadn't made a huge impact in Europe, decided to partner with a company that was making machines that would probably sell quite a lot, which makes sense. NEC also, I think, the same thing, because they made driver chips for it, and so they also gave Amstrad a really good deal. Makes entire sense when you think of it like that. I think Amstrad also had a lot of leeway in terms of making the discs as well, and so that was another thing they'd negotiated. So yeah, it kind of makes perfect sense, really. Yeah, it wasn't what would become the standard. It wasn't really the standard at this point. It was getting there, but it wasn't the standard. But what would become the standard, but it was still a cheap method of getting a disk drive on a home machine. So yeah, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. On the back, there is a floppy drive port as well, and that's a Sugar interface, which is a standard floppy drive interface. So you could, with a couple of ROM changes and stuff, actually run a 3.5-inch floppy drive anyway, or even a 5.25 if you wanted to get one of those. So there were ways of getting on there, but didn't really matter in the end. Amstrad used this on a lot of machines, a lot of their PCW range as well, and also obviously the Plus 3 used it. A few other machines used it. It was used a fair amount in Japan. Obviously the Plus 3 ended up with one because Amstrad were building it and they were using the same stocks. So yeah, it does make perfect sense. It seems weird now, but now we're living in a world where 3.5 was the was the format that won, and it wasn't really the case back then. It was winning, certainly, but it hadn't won. So it does make sense when you look at it that way. So, yeah. This was the machine, really, which carried the home market for quite a while until 1990, when it was replaced with the redesigned, like extensively redesigned Plus models. And it was moderately successful. It sold an awful lot of units around Europe. It didn't do hugely well in America, but that was a very experimental market for Amstrad, so that's probably part of that. But yeah, no, it did as well around Europe as the 464 did, really. Floppy drives were becoming kind of the in thing, so having a machine that was already popular in Europe and adding a floppy drive was a guaranteed winner. The 128K obviously was icing on the cake. I suspect they were inspired by Sinclair. Well, really the Investortronics. But also, I mean, they went through the same issues with Spain as Sinclair did, where it was really hard to release a machine that had less than 128K, really, well, that only had 64 and below, without incurring huge fees. So whilst they had their little tricky, the special and very rare 472, which just added an extra memory block on to make it 72K, so it passed the criteria. That memory did nothing. They did need a proper way of doing it. So going to 128K, that kind of made sense. The technology was out there and already used for mapping above the 64K that the Z80 could normally handle. So yeah, it's a good machine. It's certainly sturdy. And it's got a fairly good amount of software as well. When you kind of dive into the library, there are some really nice games, which we will look at a few now. Right, so here we are, and this is a fairly familiar screen if you've seen my previous video on the 464. Yeah, not a huge amount of change. Obviously, we now see that it's 128K. Other than that, it's pretty much the same, apart from little things like there's a few extra commands, so we can type this, which will fail. Well, hopefully. And that, if we had a CPM disk in the drive, that would allow the disk to boot. We don't have a CPM disk in the drive, so that should come back with an error at some point. There we go. So we can cancel that. So this time we'll just get into some games. Here we are with Barbarian 2, which doesn't really have that much to the original one. A few extra levels, some extra things, but it does look really nice on the Amstrad. So let's get this started. It can use joystick. I'm using the rather nice Cheetah Ballistics. Nice but badly named. It's a nice game. It looks really colourful. It's very, very fast as well. It's quite dull, but then that's that's Barbarian for you. I quite like it actually. It's far too simplistic for a fighting game. But then the original came out before kind of the rise of the big fighting games. Hey, I managed to shove his head off. That's the go-to move on Barbarian. As long as you can do that, you can be happy. And it's like, yeah, the animation's really nice. The graphics are colourful. They're not too confusing. And sounds nice as well. Yeah. It's a good game. It really is. Let's move on to another one. Right, so finally we play Pulsator. This is an odd game. But again, it's nice and colourful and it moves really quick. It's again not one I've been particularly huge fan of, but it certainly has a lot of fans. But yeah, it's just very, very quick, while still being very colourful. Anyway, before we finish, we'll quickly show off CPM and then we'll kind of talk about it. Right, so here we are back at the main prompt, and we just type pipe and CPM. And if you've got a CPM disk in the drive, then it should just load it up. And there we go. It is now in CPM. It's that simple. So we can do a directory, and we can load stuff we want to. So should load up the editor. There you go. So yeah, it made for a very simple CPM machine and a very cheap CPM machine as well. Right, well that's that then. I really like this machine. I do find myself hearkening for the nice coloured keys of the 464. But other than that, it's a really nice machine. It's a nice simple way to get games on a Amstrad because of the especially using a GoTech, a lot faster as well. But yeah, no, I like it. I've been after one for a while. I'm glad I got one. I would like a 664 as well, just so I've got that collection. The 1990s were an interesting time. The Amiga and ST were very much established. The IBM-compatible PCs were becoming cheap enough to rent in more homes, partly helped by Amstrad's own compatible machines, and consoles were finally starting to break into the European market. You'd have expected Amstrad to cut their losses on their 8-bit line and just concentrate on their growing IBM PCs. Instead, they doubled down. Here we have the 6128 and the 464 Plus. They've dropped the CPC moniker, but we still have the same model naming, with the 464 having a tape deck and 64K memory, and the 6128K having 128K memory and a disk drive. And yes, the disk drive is still very much a 3-inch model. Obviously, they didn't have much option if they wanted to maintain compatibility to the previous lines. Just looking at the aesthetics, you can see the redesigned cases are still very large, but they look a little bit more like the 16-bit machines that were starting to really take hold of the market. And this, of course, is not an accident. On the side, over here, oh, there we go, we have a dedicated cartridge slot. Obviously a nice addition, especially with the release of compatible console, but it also means that you have to insert a... Oh, almost there we go. It also means you have to insert a cartridge with Locomotive Basic if you just want to use the Basic, unlike obviously the previous machines which would just boot up to Basic. The main differences are on the inside. Redesigned custom silicon that both enhances the abilities and simplifies the hardware. There are obviously good things, but the downside that when things go wrong, it could be a lot harder or even impossible to fix. Let's look at the graphics first. The biggest addition, possibly, being the introduction of hardware sprites, something that both the CPC and Sinclair Spectrum were missing in their fight against the Commodore 64. Color support has been increased to 31 from a palette of 4096. The original CPC having 16 from a palette of 27. The Plus colors are split between background and sprites, though, with background having 16 and sprites having 15. Sound benefits from the addition of DMA transfer, meaning more complicated music and sound effects can be employed without affecting the main CPU. The Plus additions are hidden behind a complicated activation sequence, ostensibly to stop it interfering with existing software, but also it appears to have been an attempt to force publishers to use the cartridge system more, although developers eventually worked out how to use the extras from tape and disc too. Whilst the Plus range is compatible with existing software, changes in the style of expansion port meant add-ons weren't directly compatible, and the removal of a tape port for the 6128 model meant it was stuck with disk and cart software without a hardware modification. Both models were released in September of 1990 with the 464 Plus pricing at $229 with a mono monitor and $329 with a colour, and the 6128 was £100 more across both models. In total, 26 games were released on cartridge. These were mostly enhanced versions of games from the CPC and another 8 or so on other media. But again, it was pretty much 100% compatible with existing CPC software, give or take a percentage here or there, I guess. Both machines come with a cartridge that features Locomotive Basic and the game Burning Rubber, which I showed you a minute ago. Right. Well, that's kind of the gump on these. So let's take a little look at the machines. We've got them both here, obviously. We've got the 464 and the 6128. Yeah, so we have our tape drive over here. It all looks very nice. These do look nice. I do like the look of these machines. They're very sleek. I guess we could compare them with, here's the 464 CPC. Yeah, it's quite a bit wider, but obviously not as deep. But yes, so still not small machines, but probably less unwieldy than the CPC range. Stay, there we go. Yeah, and the 6128, obviously, difference being it's got the floppy drive on the side. Yeah, so if we, doesn't matter which one we look at, to be honest, other than that, they're both the same. The keyboards are identical. Obviously, this one is slightly more coloured than this one. It's been affected by the sun a little bit more. So if we look at the side, yeah, we've got that cartridge port we talked about, the on-off switch, which will only activate if there's a cartridge in there. This is for the light gun accessories and such like. This is an analog joystick port, and these are two normal digital joysticks, and there's a sound out as well. Oh, and then on the back, we have disk drive, Centronics ports, and serial ports as well. So, yeah, not much. And again, yeah, obviously the disk drive there. And yeah, the 464 Plus is identical. I say that, I'm pretty sure it is. Oh, well, yeah. Well, the one thing that's missing, which is a weird thing to miss, is the Centronics port. But that's because the insides of these, if you've seen our video on upgrading a 464 Plus to a 6128 Plus, then you'll know that none of the disk drive control software hardware is in here. So that's why it's missing it. Although, yeah, I guess it would have cost more. They came also with the same joystick as the GX4000. Obviously, with the cartridges, it needs these two buttons. If you're just playing normal CPC software, you could just use a normal joystick. Well, we have really showing off software for this already. Obviously, the CPC stuff is, we showed it off in the CPC lot, and we showed off a couple of cartridges on the GX4000, so maybe we'll show a couple of other ones. So let's go and play some games. Okay, well, first of all, we just put in the Logo Basic and Burning Rubber thing, and this comes with this menu. If you leave it just running without pushing a button, then it will eventually auto start Burning Rubber, like so. So here we are. This is Operation Thunderbolt, follow up to Operation Wolf. Obviously, this is better with a light gun, but I do not own one, so therefore we'll just be using the joypad. Yeah, and the idea, if you haven't played it, is just to shoot the things on the screen as they come towards you. And there's extra ammo and stuff like that. It's, yeah, if you play Operation Wolf, it's basically the same, with just this kind of imagery that you're moving forwards across a road, and it's really nice and colourful. But it's a game that really benefits from having a light gun. Really, without a light gun, you're just kind of scrolling left and right. So yeah, there's not much to this game. This is basically it. But yeah, again, it's colourful. It moves pretty quickly. Amstrad does a really good job of this. Anyway, on to the last game. And it's Robocop 2. Again, kind of another cartridge conversion from an existing game with a few extra touches here and there. But again, it moves really quick. Oops, fell on the hole. Yeah, this is a game that does do the button correctly, and I tried to push up to jump because I'm used to that, and yeah, it's not up to jump. Yeah. it moves really quickly, including, it's almost like everything's been sped up. I guess just because they could. Oh, oops. Anyway, that's it. That's the kind of the last of our Amstrad 8-bit videos. They are really nice machines. These are quite hard to get hold of nowadays. They do sell for a premium. The 464 Plus does sell for quite a bit less than the 6128, and like we proved in our video, you can just make effectively a 6128 using the Plus. So if you can't get one, go for that. But I think they're worth owning. It's kind of like the GX4000. They were released kind of after when they were really valuable, after when the 16-bit world and home PCs were coming kind of into the market. But unlike the GX4000, there was a really valid reason for having these. These were a budget option compared to Amstrad's PC line, and also the Amiga and Atari ST. So it had a place. They were quite a decent upgrade on the CPC range, but yeah, not enough to keep people buying it to the degree I imagine that Amstrad wanted. But still, nice machines to own now. I think they look great. They are relatively reliable, so there's not much you'll have to do. The power switch, like on the CPC range, sometimes needs some cleaning, but other than that, they're usually pretty good. It's the 1990s and the home console market is just hotting up, and after narrowly avoiding being hit by the worst of it during the games computer crash, the home computer market in the UK is starting to feel the pinch. So Amstrad, led by Alan Sugar, decides to follow the old adage, if you can't beat them, join them, and releases the GX4000 to the waiting market. And here it is. This is the GX4000 in its rather wonderful spaceship styling. I know it's a little bit divisive, but I like it. I think it's a nice, simple design. Yeah, it's a nice size, and I guess I like the curves. It's a nice machine. It's a Z80 based console running at 4 MHz with 64K of memory and 16K of video memory. It's based on Amstrad's 64K Plus model computer, the later improved version of their home computers. It was introduced in September 1990 and discontinued less than a year later after selling around 15,000 units. Now that sales figure is a bit of a bone of contention though. I know a few people don't fully agree with it. Some claim it must have sold more because the sheer amount available, and it's true, if you go on eBay and such like and other auctions, you will find a few of them. A lot of them boxed as well. I suspect that the difference is that the 15,000 is the official figure released, but I don't think that's including all of the bargain basement sales that happened afterwards, because Amstrad didn't take back a lot of stock. Sometimes when a product is either recalled or ends it run early, the supplier will buy stock back or take it back if it's on a per sale basis. And that didn't happen with a lot of these, so I suspect retailers were kind of just dumping them on the market, and Amstrad didn't actually include that in the official sales figures, which kind of makes a lot of sense. Because of its poor sales, publishers abandoned the platform early, especially damning when you consider that most of the kind of unreleased games were just going to be ports from the home computers anyway, and that was a fairly simple job. So yeah, in the end, 27 games were released, including the pack-in title Burning Rubber. The quality of the games varies wildly, with Robocop 2, Pang, Plotting, Navy Seals, Switchblade, and Burning Rubber considered to be the cream of the bunch. Now, we'll get to those games later, obviously. So we'll just have a little look at the console itself. Like I say, I really do like the styling. Obviously, the cartridge with its protective dust doors there. That's the big old on-off switch, which does lock one of the doors of that to stop you from trying to put a cartridge in early. That's at least one safety measure they took. We'll get to that in a minute. There's a pause button here. There isn't one on the actual controller. So if I bring the controller over. Yeah, so the controller itself, we'll go for the controller, why not? The controller itself, nice simple affair. It looks like it's heavily based on the NES and Master System controllers. It's an okay D-pad, buttons are alright as well. It's not a bad controller all in all. But yeah, there's no pause button or start and stop on there at all. So the big pause button on the front there, but that's also similar to what Sega did as well. Yeah, power LED, obviously. Let's look at the front first. Why not? The front's quite interesting in of itself. So there's an RJ11 socket here, and this was used for well, it was going to be used for peripherals, but mostly it was used for a light gun. A third-party light gun was released. Came with a couple of games, Skeet Shooter and The Enforcer, but those were basically the only games that made real use of it. Two normal connected Atari style joystick connectors, and an analog port in the middle, which is possibly the most interesting part of it, actually, the front. It's compatible with IBM PC analog joysticks. Now, it was basically unused in software, although there are a few games that seem to pay some use to it, especially actual CPC games rather than GX4000 ones. But it was there and available as a peripheral, and a headphone socket there, so you can get sound out of headphones. So on the back, yeah, so we have two power holes. Yeah, so this is going to use some description. This is quite an important part of this because it also feeds into later on as part of the reason why the GX4000 did not do so well. So yes, two power switches, and that's because the CPC machines, they had this kind of foible where they were expected to be powered using a monitor, and so the power and the video would all come from the monitor and go into here, or into a CPC machine. And this was set up to do the same. So this power socket here and this video socket here are designed to be powered using the CPC and other home computer range monitors. So that's a 5-volt socket and a video socket there. This here was the one that's designed to use an external power supply, and that was a slightly ropey 11-volt job. And yeah, this is one of the huge factors of the GX4000. And it's a special important note: if you ever buy one, do not use the power supply that comes with it. It is awful. There's a huge problem with these where if you have the power supply plugged in, you put it into the socket or take it out of the socket when it's on, then it will blow up something inside your GX4000. If you're lucky, it will be a resistor or something, or a voltage regulator. If you're unlucky, it will be something more harder to replace. So yeah, that's not bad. You can just use a decent universal 9-volt center positive AC adapter, and that will power it fine. Though still, yeah, don't remove it or put it in when it's on. You shouldn't do that anyway, to be fair. Yeah, so a SCART socket, because SCART was kind of where we were going at the point. And I don't know what this switch does, actually. I never looked it up. I think it's probably just a signal switch or something. Possibly for this, or possibly to switch this between CCAM and a normal SCART. Who knows? It doesn't matter. I'll probably put a description on there. And this is an RF jack if you want to use the worst possible picture quality. So yeah, I mean, I really like it. I really do like it. It's at the bottom there. See the all the details of it. Nice Amstrad label there. Yeah, I genuinely like this machine. I really do. It's in terms of styling, certainly. Yeah, I think it just looks nice. Right, so I guess then we get to something that we've glossed over a little bit up to now, and why did this fail? Right, so there are quite a few reasons. I guess a primary one is that this was very, very capable of competing with third-generation consoles, so the NES and the Master System. You'll see later on when we play some games, it's a powerful enough machine, definitely, to compete with those. Unfortunately, when this was released in 1990, the advertising for the next generation of consoles, the 16-bit era, was already in full swing. The Mega Drive was released about the same time as this, and nobody wanted an 8-bit console anymore. If you look at how many this sold, as in the official sales figures, you can see that people were looking at this as being a budget model. If they couldn't afford a Mega Drive and they weren't willing to wait or couldn't afford a Super Nintendo, then yeah, they got this, which wasn't great. Wasn't great at all. And there's a few, like, one of its target audiences would have been like people that had the home computers, especially Amstrad home computers, because like similar games on a home console It would have been an ideal upgrade path. Unfortunately, that was also one of the huge problems with it as well. So when you look at it and you look at the games for those home computers that people already owned, would have been between £3 and £4. And then those almost exact same games, like with barely any improvements, would have been £20 to £30 to buy on this. With no benefit of buying them on this other than the loading speed. and that was not going to be a seller for this system. Absolutely not. And that would have been one of the key demographics for Amstrad to push to. The other reasons are Amstrad just lacked the money required to defeat Sega and Nintendo in the market. Sega and Nintendo could just fire off advert after advert and pay for huge advertising campaigns. Amstrad simply couldn't do that. And so this just got missed by a lot of people. It turned up in shops, but it didn't get much of a fanfare. And people were looking forward to those 16-bit consoles because of the amount of the advertising blitz that was happening for them. Amstrad were solely responsible for making the cartridges for this as well, for manufacturing. They did shop around the idea of allowing other people to make cartridges, kind of similar to what eventually Electronic Arts would get with the Mega Drive. But as far as we're aware, nobody took them up on that. It certainly didn't seem to happen anyway. And so with Amstrad being the only source of cartridges, publishers just weren't getting those cartridges fast enough, and so they weren't getting into shops in key times. And so they were missing key release dates. So that, again, didn't help them with the publishers, didn't help them with the public. And that's that leads up to the last one, which we touched on with the power socket. And this had a few design flaws, which resulted in quite a few returns, like the power socket blowing up the machine. Eventual models had little instruction booklets in it saying, don't, make sure it's plugged in before you turn it on and off. That's, but it was kind of too late. These would go back to Amstrad, and people would get a return one, but by that point, again, they've lost faith, and they're going for machines that were basically bulletproof comparatively, the Mega Drive and later on the SNES. So, yeah, it is unfortunate. And when you look at some of the kind of the rumours that came out of Amstrad at that time, this was very nearly a 16-bit console. And that could have been brilliant. I mean, once again, when we look at the games, you'll see it could definitely have competed with those 8-bit consoles. A 16-bit version might have done a really, really good job with Amstrad able to make consoles slightly cheaper. It could have been good, but yeah, that obviously never came to pass. And instead, we got what was effectively an Amstrad Plus computer in a console shell. It's a shame. It really is a shame. I think it's a fantastic little console. But you know what? The only way you can tell that of a console is by looking at the games, which we're going to do now. And here we are with some games. And yeah, we're using the C4 CPC cartridge to play these games. Now, normally I wouldn't bother showing this, obviously. I just go into games. But yeah, there's a few things that I kind of want to show before we go into them. So if we go back onto this and we go to this whole thing's weird, don't worry about it. But if we go here, we can see that there are numerous games that aren't GX4000 games. So there are some ports here of games. Not all of them work, to be honest, but some do. So these are games that wouldn't have been available but have been hacked to work with the GX4000. I wouldn't imagine it would take a lot of hacking, to be honest. But there are some classic games like Afwi de Monty. So if we go into that, and we can see it's got a trainer on there, but also a trainer that's geared towards the 2 buttons on the joystick. So if we push 2 for no, then we can skip those. All right, and there we go. Yeah, it says press space fire, but we could just hit the first button and it'll go. And there we are. So, yeah, I mean, the Afwi de Monty on the Amstrad was quite a nice looking game anyway. So, it's not... no, there we go. But it's a nice addition, and yeah, and it just shows nowadays that, yeah, they didn't release many games for this, but there are now more options. But anyway, we're not really here to play Monty. We're here to play games that actually came out for the GX4000. So here we are with Barbarian 2. And yeah, so this main menu thing here, we get to choose between warrior and princess, and those buttons, those numbers actually obviously match up to the buttons 1 and 2. So let's choose the warrior, number 1. And yeah, so all of the tape loading stuff and everything has been skipped out. We don't, yeah, okay, we can't obviously do keyboard, but it's set to joystick automatically, so we need to push 1 to start. Yeah, these cartridges obviously were also compatible with the, oh, I've managed to turn myself around, that's not good. This game, turn back, damn it. Turn back. No, just turn back. Oh. Yeah, so yeah, these cartridges would also work with the Plus consoles, the Plus computers as well. And so yeah, some of the cartridges did have keyboard options, but it did know to default to a joystick, which is good. It's a pretty game as well. I mean, yeah, this is easily rivaling what the Master System and the NES could do. It would certainly have competed well. Right, you've got, yeah, okay, now I've worked out. You've got to push fire and then down. It's got 2 buttons, but it doesn't really use it in this game. Right, but yeah, the pause button, there you go, just hits pause. So there we are. Let's go to a different game. Right, so this is the pack-in title, Burning Rubber, also considered one of the best games on it. And yeah, it's pretty good. It's not bad. One of the things that annoys me about this game is, if we just start now as default, then you have to push up to accelerate. On a 2-button joystick, a joypad, and it knew there were going to be 2 buttons because obviously, you know, it's running on the GX4000. And yeah, again, it could have been on the computer, but they know that you're using a GX4000 because they've changed some of the options, so they could have changed the default key and about as well. But argument aside, you can just push 2 and set the controls, so 1 to set controls, and so we can just change, like gear down can be down, gear up can be up, accelerate 1, brake 2, and then yeah, left and right obviously just being left and right. So yeah, so now if we start, we've got a much more sensible control scheme. And this looks really nice. I mean, compare it to some of the racing games on the 8-bit systems, and this is really good. So yeah, nice big sprites. There's a decent feeling of speed. It's not impossible to play. It reacts quite well. The joypad isn't the greatest, mind you, but you know, I've played worse. So yeah, it's really nice. The sound's good. The graphics look good. It runs at a fair speed. So yeah, it would have competed quite well. And one of the really upsetting things is one of the games that was planned to be released on this was Outrun, and it would have been really interesting to see how well Outrun had done on this on the GX4000. But it was cancelled again due to publishers losing faith. But no, a nice game, and you can definitely, ooh, look at that. That is very Outrun. And you can see why it's considered one of the best games. Right, one more game then. Right, so this is Switchblade. Not a game I'm particularly fond of, I'll be honest. I just find it quite dull. But it is thought of quite highly, and technically it's certainly impressive. Yeah, so a bit of a intro sequence. Right, and here we are. So yeah, we've got 2-button control, which is good. So jumping on the second button and then attacking with a bar at the bottom. You can see there, you hold it down on the left button. And yeah, it's not as colourful as some games perhaps, but it does move really quick. And sound and music, so you know. Here we go. We killed it. Yeah, I don't find it particularly an interesting game, that's all. But it's good enough. It's pretty good compared to 8-bit machines, but yeah, if you try and compare this to 16-bit machines, then it does start to pale then, but honestly, it's fine. Oops, a bit of full damage. Hold down our attacks. But yeah, it's pretty enough. It moves quickly. It's got a decent use of colour, really. And it's got nice sound and music, so you know. Yeah, look at that animation on that guy. It's pretty good. Also very colourful, that guy, so why is... never mind. Why is Switchblade not colourful when he is? Yeah, some of them look like walls and they're not. Anyway, I'm not particularly fond of this game, but it is a nice enough game, certainly. You know, we'll let ourselves get ourselves kicked there. Oh, by the way, the switch on the back, I will put it on a little comment as well. The switch is to select the sound source, so if you're using the monitor, I'm assuming, you can switch it to use the headphone socket at the front to put the sound through, or just if you're using the headphone socket at the front, I guess. But yeah, anyway. Well, the GX4000, it's a much maligned machine. I think probably mostly by people that haven't really played it. The games that came with it are okay. There's some decent enough games, not enough of them. But now that a lot of other games have been ported to it, it's quite a nice way of playing Amstrad games. And there were some very, very good Amstrad games that are now available on this machine. And I like it, I really do. Ignoring all of its flaws, which yes, there are a few of them, it's a nice machine. And it looks nice, and some of the games it's got do play very, very well.
The present is horrible, the future looks bleak. Remember our childhood to get us through